welcome back for this wonderful series, Somatic Mondays with the Friendly Circle Berlin and Jan Winhall. Many of you know Jan. She has written an incredible new book called 20 Embodied Practices for Healing Trauma and Addiction, along with many other books and many, many years of practice in the field of addiction. And she brings a really interesting and fresh perspective to our healing journey. And she has been incredibly generous with her time and in coming to do this series and other talks with us. She was just at our Dublin conference. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jan. Jan, it's great to see you. And I've made you a co-host, so you should be able to unmute there. And
There we go.
then maybe at the beginning you want to let us know about, you made us an incredible offer, so I'll put it in chat and then we can follow up on that. But
Okay.
hey, Jan, it's great to see you. Thank you.
To see you too, Patrick. Always fun. Always really great to see you and all of you. Honestly, it's my favorite group to hang out with. I think it's because people are very real here, and that's a wonderful way to be in the world. I can see Robert here. Thank you, Robert, for coming. Robert is almost always here with me. It's amazing. Okay, so we're going to talk about neuroception today, which is a really fascinating process in the body. And it's actually a word that Steve Porges made up. And he made up that word because there wasn't a word that described what neuroception is all about. So before we dig into that, I just wanted to follow up with what Patrick was saying. On July 30th, we're going to start an author book study series. So I'm going to be, I guess I think they're 90 minutes, actually, like this is. It'll be on Wednesdays from in the afternoon. I think it's 12 to 1:30 ET. And that's where we're going to go through both of my books and take a kind of deeper dive into some of the ideas. So we will do some somatic practices because we always do when I'm working, we always go into the body. But we'll be really looking at the ideas and how these ideas and concepts, one of them being neuroception, has really shaped how we think about addiction and trauma responses now. And I'll share with you some of the background around things like going to visit Harville Hendricks and Helen Kelly Hunt in Dallas, Texas, and just some of the neat kind of things that I've been able to explore and to be with other people, lots of whom you will know. And it's kind of fun to see the inside of writing a book. Also, if you're interested in writing, it's a great way to hang out. And to be in community like we are now, to be sharing how we understand these ideas. And some of the ideas in polyvagal theory are pretty complicated. You know, the first time I ever met Steve Porges back in 2012 and heard him talk, it was pretty overwhelming, I found, a lot of the ideas. So what I've tried to do is take the main concepts and make them as clear and simple to understand as possible and as embodied, right? So all of those different, I talk about 5 lessons in polyvagal theory. One of them is around neuroception that we'll do today. And we're going to do a practice that takes the word neuroception and drops it down into the body. And you can do that in your own process as deeply as you feel is right to go at the time. We'll talk about that because coming into the body when we're struggling with addiction is really a scary thing, right? Okay, so we're going to go through some of the slides that help, I think, to really explain the model. A lot of my work is very graphic. There's lots of images, lots of color and shape. And that's because when we're working in the body, we're working with color and shape and feelings, deep feelings. They are stored in the right hemisphere. And so I find that working with pictures, with images, the language of the body really helps to explain the concepts. So I'm going to share first, and then we'll spend some time hanging out. Just give me a minute here. What is this thing? I want to go bigger. There we go. Everybody see that? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay, so most of you probably know I created this felt sense polyvagal model. So this is a bringing together of Steve Porges' work with polyvagal theory and also Eugene Gendlin's work with what he called the felt sense. So the felt sense is that deep, embodied, felt place where we experience a lot of kind of bubbling up of truths about our lives that we tend to squish and sometimes really numb and dissociate, especially in addiction, because they're too painful and overwhelming to be with, and rightfully so. But the journey, we know, is the journey that brings us back into the body. Okay, so when I first began working back 45 years ago, some of you know this story, and I always need to start when I'm sharing about the model with where it began, really. And this was with a group of young women who were sexual abuse survivors. And it was in that experience that I really uh, felt profoundly that the traditional ways that we were understanding self-harm and addiction were not helpful. In fact, in a lot of ways, they were really hurting the people that I was trying to help, trying to be of service, because of the judgment, right? And so you see now too, right? We have this model that both treats, I think, addiction in a lot of ways in terms of being bad. And so we end up with the legal system, and also seeing people as being sick, which often ends up putting them into hospital and creating this kind of pathologizing model of addiction. And while it's a better model, it's a more humane model than the bad model, I think we can do even better in terms of how we understand the embodiment of addiction. And the way of being able to do that I found in my journey, in my travels, was through polyvagal theory. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. And so I went searching because I'm a curious being, like I think probably all of us here are, and tried to find a way of understanding what was going on for these young women with just having a clear way of being with them, without judging, without putting diagnoses, without doing any of that, but just listening to what they were telling me. And I found the feminist therapist community, which I found to be profoundly helpful in terms of making some sense out of the kinds of things that people were doing that were self-harming, but were also, as they were explaining to me without really understanding it, they were also these ways of that became addictive, like cutting the body, drinking a lot, unsafe sex, a lot of behaviors that were high-risk behaviors that were not safe in the body, but on some curious level were helping them. And as I listened, what I heard was that there was a way in which these behaviors were either numbing people to bring relief or waking them up from this numbing state. And so Ellen Bass and Laura Davis wrote this wonderful book, The Courage to Heal, back in 1988. This was embodiment. This was really a powerful, profound way of understanding trauma and addiction. And I've really had the experience of seeing over 45 years now how what they were saying back then in 1988, which was considered highly controversial, is now becoming, in some ways, the mainstream in the trauma world. Maybe not in the traditional psychiatric world, but we're having a real impact. We're really getting the message out there that we need to be connected to what's going on in the body to be able to really help people with suffering. And so Ellen Bass and Laura Davis said in this book, the problems survivors experience with their bodies, splitting and numbing addictions, began as attempts to survive. So this is a polyvagal statement. It's a statement that understands the nervous system and how every way that we respond in our body is on some level seeking some kind of adaptive response through the nervous system. And then I found Judith Herman's work, which some of you will be familiar with, but I, again, always include it in case there are new people. And, I've also found that this kind of paradigm shift from seeing addiction as pathologizing to seeing it as actually an adaptive nervous system response, it takes a long time for people to really get that. Like you can kind of see it as interesting in your brain, in your mind, but to really feel it in your body, to really know it in your body, the way that I do now, it takes time. So I think it's worth repeating, and I repeat it a lot these days in teaching and presenting, but that's okay. So Judith Herman says in Trauma and Recovery, and again, if you haven't read it, it is a must read. Abused children generally discover at some point that they can produce major, though temporary, alterations in their affective state by inducing autonomic crisis or extreme autonomic arousal. So here we see that back in the early 1990s, Judith Herman was connecting self-harming behaviors with the autonomic nervous system, the part of the body that is monitoring for how safe we are and responds to how safe we are by shifting us into different states to help us to survive. And the most common one of those that I think everybody knows and you're familiar with is the flight-fight state in the body, right? When you're startled and your body goes up into, how do I get out of here? Or how do I fight back? That's the autonomic nervous system, right? And she goes on and says, the feelings can be most effectively terminated. These uncomfortable, intense feelings, we can stop them most effectively by a major jolt to the body. And the most dramatic method of achieving this result is through the deliberate infliction of injury. So here we see the sequence. There's a really uncomfortable, intolerable feeling state. A major way of shifting that state is through the nervous system. And the best way to do that is through a dramatic jolt to the body, which wakes the body up or shuts the body down. And we do that through an infliction of injury. And she says that while self-injury is the most spectacular soothing mechanism, children and adults find many other ways to induce major alterations in affective state and in neurophysiological state. Purging and vomiting, compulsive sexual behavior, so eating dysregulation, sex addiction, compulsive risk-taking or exposure to danger, and the use of psychoactive drugs become the vehicles by which abused children attempt to regulate their internal emotional states. So here Judith Herman is laying the groundwork for decades later, our more sophisticated understanding of how addictions develop and how they help us by shifting states in the nervous system so that we can survive. So this is profound, and it is revolutionary in terms of how we then understand and make sense out of these things that we do that hurt us in the short term, right? They help us, sorry, in the short term. They hurt us in the long term, but we still keep doing them. So this moves us away from shaming. It moves us away from silencing and into an empowered way of understanding how bodies work at a very basic neurophysiological response level. And then Beecher, it's always interesting. When I wrote my first book, Treating Trauma and Addiction with the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model, I went searching around for research that helped us to kind of see, well, where other people must have been curious about this. Did anybody do any research into it? So there was some research, and I wish there was more. But Beecher this was way back in 1946. Beecher was a surgeon working with soldiers that were wounded in the Italian front. And he observed that 75% of the severely wounded didn't request morphine. So here's a man who's really paying attention to how the body is responding to pain, right? And he noticed that strong emotions seem to block pain. So there's, again, this way of beginning to put together that there's a rhythm here in the body, that when the body moves into intense emotion and physical pain, the next piece that happens there in that process has something to do with blocking pain, numbing pain. And this foreshadowed what those of you who are familiar with the dorsal branch of the vagus nerve, this foreshadowed Steve Porges connecting this numbing and dissociating and shutting down function of the autonomic nervous system. And that's a new thing. That is a new way of kind of understanding this new phase in the nervous system that Steve Porges has named. And that, again, is a big deal in terms of how we understand our neurophysiology. So we're looking here at really shifting the paradigm. We're saying, oh, there's something about the way that bodies learn when they're in a state of threat, how to survive by shutting down or by waking up. And that's a fascinating thing. And so that shifts us into then saying, well, maybe these behaviors that we've been deciding are maladaptive are actually adaptive behaviors. Maybe they're actually helping us. And so when we move from bypassing the body, which we do in our top-down Western culture, into really honoring how mind and body connects and how there is this innate wisdom in the body. And we all know this on some level, because we know that, for example, if we're getting sick, our temperature can rise as a way of trying to combat infection, right? We don't think about that. We don't say to ourselves, I better raise my temperature because I'm getting sick. It's unconscious. And so is neuroception. This way that we are unconsciously tracking how safe we are right now. As I'm here with you and we're in our group together, we're tracking to see how safe we feel unconsciously all the time. And the body is shifting us into different autonomic states to be able to manage that so that we'll survive. So this is all about slowing things down, right? Because you can't connect in with these embodied processes if we're talking too much. And one of the worst things I think that's happened in our culture is that we talk too much. And we've really lost this beautiful way of slowing things down. and being able to listen to what's going on inside us, right? But we also know that when we develop rigid pathways that become addictive, and while they hurt us, they also help us, we know that it doesn't feel safe to slow things down. It doesn't feel safe to listen to the body, because when we have been in those states, we've been hurt. And it doesn't matter who defines the hurt or who defines what trauma is. It's none of their business. What trauma is what you feel in your body that's overwhelming. Doesn't matter how anybody else defines it. If it feels overwhelming to be with yourself quietly inside, then you're shifting up into this defensive state to be able to live. And the sad thing about that is, well, while it keeps you alive, you miss all the goodies. And we're going to see that. So when I found polyvagal theory, I was thrilled, because it gave me a way of understanding and finding a home for what I knew intuitively. And I saw this quote, if you're new to polyvagal theory, Steve Porges' pocketbook is a really good way to start. Or even if you're not new to it, I really enjoyed it because it's a series of conversations and interviews with Steve. And this is really the way that he shines. It's hard to read Steve Porges when he's in his real academic world, you know, that big scary blue book, the polyvagal world. The polyvagal theory is hard to read. But when you hear him speaking and teaching and working in groups, he really comes alive and is able to really convey what it is that he's talking about. And you can feel it in him as a human being. So in the last chapter of the pocketbook, my friend Serge Pringle, who is a focusing teacher and a focusing oriented therapist like I am, he introduced me to Steve Porges back in 2018 at a conference, and that really changed my life. And he interviews Steve in the last chapter of the pocketbook. And here he says, so this is Steve's wonderful words: if we want individuals to feel safe, we don't accuse them of doing something wrong or bad. We explain to them how their body responded, how their responses are adaptive, how we need to appreciate this adaptive feature, and how the client needs to understand that this adaptive feature is flexible and can change in different contexts. Then we can use our wonderfully creative and integrative brain to develop a narrative that treats our atypical behaviors not as bad, but as understandable in terms of adaptive functions that may often be heroic. So beautiful. Such a wonderful way of understanding how bodies work, and how when we get into these states of threat in particular, the body will respond in a way that is adaptive and often heroic. So here's the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve in the body and extends from the brain stem, so at the back of your head here, above your neck, and it goes right down the center of your body. And it feeds information from all of your organs up into the brainstem. So 80% of that information that's coming up into the brainstem is coming from what's going on in your body. And because we live in a top-down world, we tend to really minimize or belittle or really just dismiss that vagus nerve and what's going on there. But when we do that, we make a big mistake, because we're cutting ourselves off from the most, I believe, important aspect, really, function of the body, which is constantly checking to see whether we feel safe or not. Because when we don't feel safe, you'll see what starts to happen. This is where addictions are born. So neuroception is the body's safety monitor. And as I said, this is a word that Steve Porges created because we just don't have a lot of language for body processes. It's actually coincidentally, Gendlin also created the term felt sense because we didn't have a language for that either. And so he created this word, neuroception, as this unconscious embodied process. And I like to think of it like a thermometer for detecting safety. And, when you feel into that in your body, you realize, right, that it's not something that you're aware of. But the really cool thing is that we can start to become somewhat aware of it as we deepen our capacity to come into the body. We can start to talk to that process in our body, and we're going to play with that today. So it occurs in the brain stem, and this is important. So the brain stem is kind of the least sophisticated part of the brain. It's street smart like your dog. It's not nuanced like the prefrontal cortex of the brain, the most sophisticated part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that is about surviving at all costs. It's not concerned with morality. It doesn't have a value system. It doesn't stop and think about things. It just responds to immediately what is going on in a very primal survival way. And so that's why a lot of the time when we're responding from that state of threat, we are not responding from the most sophisticated part of our brain that is helping us to be our best selves. This is the part that is helping us to just stay alive. And that's why a lot of the time in the state of addiction, we do things that we don't feel good about, that violate our value system, that feel bad and hurt people, ourselves, and the people around us. It's really important to get that because it's not a conscious thing. It's a really, really important thing to understand about how brains work. Because I've found in doing this work for over 40 years, one of the worst things about healing from addiction, coming into the prefrontal cortex, waking up, is realizing the things that you've done that you feel ashamed about. So we have a way of explaining that through neuroplasticity and through understanding how the brainstem, how when you're in a state of threat, you're not worried about that. You're simply worried about surviving, like any animal. So it's interesting because we have these ways of responding that we call habitual, or some people call faulty neuroception. And this happens when, in fact, we're actually safe, but we feel triggered. We feel activated by something that feels very scary and threatening. It's often something that is kind of a traumatic experience that's kind of held there in the body, kind of floating around in your experience of the world, floating around in your felt sense of the body. And it gets activated by something that's happening now. And in that state, it feels like it's really happening right now, even though it could have been literally 30 years ago. And that we would call habitual, because you're kind of going back to this old way of reading a situation of threat, even when it's not there now. The cool thing, and this is a really, I think, important part of understanding addiction and trauma responses like dissociation through polyvagal theory and through neuroplasticity is understanding that we can actually rewire that faulty neuroception by talking to neuroception inside you, by talking like the way that you would to your dog. So you're walking down the street with your dog, you see somebody, your dog doesn't know this person, they go into a kind of alarm state. What's going on here? This person's approaching us. You know this person, and you say to your dog, "It's okay. It's Robert. All's good." And we can learn to do that with ourselves, with our own process of that part of ourselves. And this is where a kind of IFS approach can be helpful too, to see this part of the self, this exile, is threatened, and the body's responding through that exiled part. But we can say through self, it's okay, it's okay. We know this person. And we can say that to that part inside us in the body, and then connect in with the body as we begin to feel more and more capacity to be able to do that. And that's a journey, right? It takes time. So we can access these cues of safety through this top-down processing, right? This is a top-down, bottom-up model, right? So we can say to ourselves, wait a minute, hang on, it's actually okay. And then bring that down, that thought, down into the body to settle ourselves. So the other thing that happens when we're feeling that sense of safety is connecting into this, what Steve Porges calls the social engagement system. So when this makes sense, right, intuitively. When you feel safe, it's nice to be able to make eye contact. It's nice to smile to another person and have that person smile back at you. It gives us these little moments of dopamine hits. It gives us moments of feeling safer with each other. And that feeling grows, right? You see the folks in this sharing a meal together. So sharing food, food is love, is often a way of coming together, enjoying each other in a way that feels very grounded and balanced. And that happens when we feel safe. When we don't feel safe, then we're preoccupied with what's going on in our body that feels very uncomfortable, right? So here's, that state of habitual or default neuroception, where we're reading danger and it feels absolutely real, even though it isn't actually happening now. And this was one of the things that I saw a lot in the group with the young women that I was working with, and later on with lots of guys. I would do groups too, where somebody would get activated by another person in the group, and you can see the shift in autonomic state. You can see them going up into a threat response, even though it wasn't actually happening now. There was something. It can be as subtle as, a movement in the body that reminds the body of threat. And there it will come right away. And so these are the kinds of experiences that then lead us into needing to be able to shut down, to cope, to survive. So the Bessel van der Kolk also became really interested in what was going on here in terms of numbing and shutting down. And he did some research. This was in 2014. Those of you who haven't read The Body Keeps the Score, this is, again, really an essential book to read about trauma and addiction. So he gathered together, and it was a small sample, only 8 war veterans, but an interesting study. And they agreed to watch violent scenes from the film Platoon. This is an old war movie in 1986. And at the same time, to take a standard pain test. They measured how long the veterans could keep their hands in a bucket of ice water. So here this is a very embodied study, right? You got your hand in a bucket of ice water. What's going on in the body? And you're watching a war movie. And then they repeated this process with a calm and peaceful movie scene. So what were they getting at here? And what they discovered was that 7 out of those 8 veterans kept their hands in the freezing water 30% longer during the violent movie. So how do we make sense out of that? Well, we could say they were masochistic. We could say they were attention seeking, which is what happens with a lot of self-harming behaviors, right? In the traditional pathologizing model. But what they learned, what they made sense to them was, we then calculated that the amount of analgesia produced by watching 15 minutes of a combat movie was equivalent to that produced by being injected with 8 milligrams of morphine, about the same dose a person would receive in an emergency room for crushing chest pain. So again, what does that tell us? That when bodies are in a state of threat, when bodies are feeling too much, there's this natural way of blocking. And that natural way of blocking and releasing these endogenous opioids, right, is what then shifts us down into that dorsal shutdown state in the nervous system that Steve Porges named. So this model is based on the organizing principle of survival, rather than the organizing principle of sickness or badness and punishment, that moral failing model. So this model is about bodies do what they need to do to survive. And they don't care, they don't give a shit about morals and values when it's about survival. And so that tells us that when we develop addictions, we have experienced that state of threat to such a degree that we've had to find these ways of being able to survive. And so what's that all about? And that's part of the unpacking, is what was under that, the trauma, the underbelly of these behaviors. So the context tells the story, right? We can understand our behavior by how we understand the context and the organizing principle. So for example, who here sees a duck? And who here sees a rabbit? And some of you will see both. See a duck and a rabbit. So we can change the paradigm. We can shift from one way of seeing something to another way of seeing something. So we could see young women in this particular context in the group who were being diagnosed as having borderline personality disorder. They were literally being treated with contempt. It was like, Jan, you go deal with it. We don't want to deal with it. They're a pain in the butt. You go deal with it. Or we could say, oh, okay, there's another way to understand these behaviors. And as Sandra Butler would say, one of my first teachers, she said, when people are behaving in these ways that drive us crazy, that are perceived as really antisocial and attention-seeking and masochistic, they're just showing you how they learned to grow up. They're just showing you what they had to do in order to survive in their families. And I never forgot that, because it just made so much sense. And now we have a way of understanding that, not just psychologically, but also neurophysiologically. People don't care about the value system when they're trying to survive. So we could say, well, what was it that you were trying to survive? What was under those behaviors? And when we can begin to understand that from both and many different perspectives, it opens things up and brings a sense of compassion and non-judgment. And then it also begins to make sense that those of us who are struggling with a kind of embodied trauma from white racism, white supremacy, from misogyny, from poverty, hypermasculinity, all these different ways that in our particular cultures, we oppress groups with these systems that keep people down or frightened or small or shamed. And it's killing us. You can see the world now, we're in a big mess. So over many years, together with clients and with students, we created a model of the nervous system that we call the 7Fs. And it's very colorful, as you can see, with lots of shapes and sizes that reflect embodied states in the nervous system. So we're going to go through each of these states. I want to give you a sense of really being able to feel into them in your body. Let's see if this is going to work. Yes. So here is this beautiful ventral state in the nervous system. This is the part of the vagus nerve that comes above the diaphragm and then up through the face, through the ear. This is the social engagement system. So when I look out at you and I can see faces that are alive and faces that are maybe smiling or looking friendly, that activates and calms my nervous system. And the ventral branch then of the vagus nerve is online. We feel present. We feel connected to other people. We feel safe. It's so precious to feel safe, right? And when we can find people that we're with that feel that kind of safety, it feels really good. We want to come back. We want to be here. Okay, so this is the main branch, one of the main branches of the nervous system. And then we have up here flight fight. So people are familiar with this is the sympathetic branch. It's not the vagus nerve. This is flight fight. So you're sitting there fairly calm, a loud noise happens and you shift up into, either running away or staying and fighting. If neither of those things are possible, say you're a little kid, you're growing up in a family where scary stuff is going on, you can't run away, you can't fight back, then what you are going to do is shut down over here in what Steve Porges named the dorsal branch of the vagus nerve. This branch of the vagus nerve is below the diaphragm, in the gut. So ventral is up above in safety, and dorsal is down below the diaphragm. And this part of the autonomic nervous system was not named before Steve Porges. And that's why it's a big deal, because his theory is challenging a traditional model of the nervous system. And when he named this branch, the dorsal branch of shutting down and just, it's like hibernating in your house. When he named that, trauma therapists like myself were like, wow, this makes sense. Because in the Judith Herman days, we talked about flooding in sympathetic and numbing in dorsal, which is what I could see in my clients. I could see them doing this and they described it, but it wasn't considered to be part of the autonomic nervous system. And so this is a big deal because he's saying, here's dissociation, here's numbing. And we all knew that it made intuitive sense to us because we could see it in the bodies, in the shape. You can see the shape, and we're going to feel into that a little bit. when we're here together. The tightness, can feel that tightness of constriction in flight fight. Can you feel that in your body? That's the rabbit in the headlights, right? And then if you can't escape, if you're just defeated and you're shutting down, that dorsal depressed state is a slump. It's moving down and in. It's the lack of social engagement, right? I don't look at you in dorsal. I avoid eye contact. In ventral, I'm open. I'm excited to see you. I'm happy to welcome you. In dorsal, I'm hiding. And that is a really important contribution that he made to understanding the nervous system. And it really makes sense in terms of understanding addiction, and we're going to get to that. Now, in addition to those three main responses, we have lots of blended states. And there are a number of different versions of and names that people are kind of talking about these different parts. Because I teach with the Polyvagal Institute and I'm connected closely with Steve, I follow what he says in terms of the blended states. I follow what he's outlined here in our Polyvagal World. This is one of the books he wrote. I think it came out, I don't know, this year or last year. And he outlined in our Polyvagal World, again, it's a great way to start reading about polyvagal theory. He outlined these blended states, and we named them a little bit differently because we played with making it simple and easy to remember by describing them in 7F states. So the blended states are when we are different branches of the nervous system are involved at the same time. And because bodies move, it only makes sense that a lot of the time we're constantly coming into new experiences. Our bodies are responding to those new experiences, and we're moving in and out of blended states in the nervous system. So, for example, an easy one to get here would be this fun, fired up state that we talk about. This is a blending of feeling safe in ventral and having some fight, flight, sympathetic energy, some adrenaline, a little bit of cortisol. This is where I am now in a kind of, this is fun for me. It's also a bit fired up in the sense that I'm busy, telling a story. I'm on a mission. And so I feel that has a lot of meaning for me in sharing this work because I think it's really important. And so we have this kind of blended feature, but I also feel safe in my body and safer more and more as I share information. Early on, I would have a lot more sympathetic energy because I'd be nervous. Now less and less. But also, a little bit there. And you can hear that when kids are playing, for example, they're running around, they're kind of, in that fun, sympathetic state, but with a sense of safety, unless they get into trouble and one of them starts crying or running home or fighting. And then over here, well, sorry, this thing is so tender. In this flowing state is a blending of dorsal stillness, but with safety. So rather than collapsing when there's no ventral energy, this is a state that blends the stillness, so immobilization, not moving, but also having safety. So this is a state of like meditation, focusing practice, pausing and noticing, lovemaking, these places where we can go that are still and safe in the body. Really precious experiences often. Here, we call this favoring others for survival. This is what people often call appeasing. This is a state where marginalized groups in our culture live, right? This is a state where addiction lives often because we don't feel safe in our bodies. We are pleasing other people that have power over us because we feel threatened and we're in a state of threat. In order for us to maintain some measure of safety, we have to be serving the person or the group over us that has power. So you see this in marginalized groups in particular. You see it often in women who are frozen or serving men. You see it in BIPOC groups. You see it in groups of people that non-binary people that are living at the margin and threatened by the power group. And then up here is really important for today. So up here, oh, sorry, this thing is so tender, is the fixate, freeze, and fawn state. This is the state of addiction. So in this state, neuroceptively, we're picking up threat, and we are shifting back and forth between sympathetic flight fight and folding in and collapsing in dorsal. And this is what we call the trauma feedback loop. And so what addictions do is they help us to shift back and forth between one and the other when there isn't enough safety in our lives to be living down here in this wonderful state of connection and social engagement. And that's just an outline of each of the different states so that you have them. And so here we see that in polyvagal theory language, addictions function as what we call state regulation survival strategies in the autonomic nervous system. So for example, you come home from work, you had a fight with your boss, you're fired up in sympathetic energy, it's really hard to settle down and relax. You drink a bottle of wine over here. In this dorsal sympathetic state, you then move down into crashing into a dorsal shutdown, numb, dissociated relief. And of course, it can move the other way. Some people can live here in dorsal for a while, and you get into these high-risk behaviors up here, which shift you back up into a sympathetic state. And that's the pattern of addiction in the autonomic nervous system. So this is really important to remember in terms of understanding a polyvagal lens on addiction. And here's a really important point. You cannot stay in one of those states forever, or you would die. That means that the body has to find a mechanism for shifting those states. And the mechanism, whatever the behavior is, if it works well, it becomes addictive because it works well. And if you don't feel safe, so you're not living down here in the empowerment feedback loop, you're going to be here and you're going to be looking for those ways. And people usually have 3 or 4 of them because you get bored with one or the other that help you to be able to stay shifting back and forth. It's way too metabolically taxing to be in sympathetic with the heart rate going like crazy forever. And it's way too intense to be down in a dorsal state where the heart rate is lower than normal. You can die, literally. So bodies are designed to survive by shifting back and forth, and they will find whatever gets you through the night to do that. And that's how addictions form in those rigid neural pathways. I can't believe it's 2:30. I wanted to do a practice with you. Well, maybe we will. Let me just see. What have I got here? This is this beautiful way in which neuroception is constantly feeling down into the body through the brainstem. And interoception, which we'll get into next time, that we meet, which is all about felt sensing, right? So I think I'm going to stop because it's 2:30. I'm going to stop.
Okay.
Yep. Well, thank you, everybody. And Patrick will get me that list of emails. And yeah, I'll see you next time because we're doing a panel on polyvagal theory and autism. And these, I should let you know, these are my podcast and they're all free. So sign up and you'll see where I'm offering lots of free things with really cool people that are smart and they're doing great work. But there were 5 people to organize and I lost out on that date. And I apologize for that, but I'll be here either 3 weeks or 5 weeks from now. Patrick will let you know.
That's great. And would you like to take us out of this session now in a manner of your choosing, Jan?
Oh, sure. Okay, well, let's pause and just check slowly. And if that doesn't feel comfortable, you can just listen. And notice now, where are you in your nervous system? Constriction with sympathetic energy, or a nice kind of balanced feeling in the muscles, or maybe some heavy lethargic because it's a bit scary to be really present. And wherever you are is just right for now. Wherever you are right now is where your body needs you to be. And also hoping a little bit that there's a little more comfort in there, a little more connection, a little more being together, a little more gratitude. Okay, so we're going to round it off. Come back to the group. Well, I feel honored, I have to tell you. You made my day. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.